Hi guys, this is Dr. Sadasivam once again with you. And in today's video, we are going to talk about the nature of emotional intelligence. Initially, we are going to talk about David POLOGRUTO, who was a high school physics teacher. What happened in this particular case was he was stabbed by a kitchen knife by one of his own students. And what is extremely surprising is that the student was one of his star students. The name of the student was Jason H. And the story was like this. He was a medical aspirant, of course, not to a normal school, but to Harvard School. And in the process, because of some grades during one of the tests, he couldn't make it to the final list of selection. He went and stabbed the teacher. Of course, the teacher was hospitalized, he was cured, etc. But there were court proceedings against Jason. And Jason was acquitted later by a bench of senior judges, psychologists, etc. But later, he graduated as a topper with a perfect score from his own school. Now, what this goes on to very clearly show is that academic intelligence has got very little to do with your emotional intelligence. Because one might think, how can such a bright boy who has been a topper in the school throughout do such a foolish thing, right? This once again proves the fact that your academic intelligence, your intelligence quotient, they've got very, very little to do with emotional intelligence. And those of you who have gone through the earlier videos which talks about your brains, your emotions, these things will become very clear as to why IQ has no connection with EQ. Now, as regards success in life, IQ contributes only 20% to the factors that determine life success. So, what do those remaining 80% contain? Those factors, obviously, they all pertain to how one is able to motivate himself, to what extent one is able to persist in the face of frustrations, how well one is able to control impulses in life, delay in gratification, regulation of one's moods, and so many other factors which are extremely important to decide the other 80%. Now, so many researches have been conducted on this particular field, and one of which is a research which is done at Harvard Business School. It was a research carried out on 95 students from the class of 1945. Typically, why is this year important? This class of 1945 is important because at that time, IQ was the prime factor for selection into any Ivy League compared to nowadays. Because nowadays, IQ is important, but it is not all that important compared to how it was at one point of time. Now, what happened was these 95 students who graduated from the class of 1945, they were followed through their middle ages, through various researches, where they go, which company they work for, how well are they performing. Because these are research studies. Obviously, you cannot complete your research through some questionnaires, because they wanted to do a thorough research, a pathfinding research over a period of time, how this guy navigates the undercurrents of various life situations, your middle age, old age, etc. We're not getting into other details of those researches. Now, very important finding from this research, most of the guys who had extremely high IQs, they were not very successful in life compared to people with low IQs. Seriously. Because IQ was absolutely not a factor at all when it came to life success. Like the guys who had lesser IQ, but guys who were good at other things like getting along with people. Some of the other factors we talked about, like motivation, persisting in the face of frustrations, how well they were able to control their impulses, delay in gratification, interpersonal skills. Those things were much more important, because guys who had those skills, they were able to progress much better in comparison to the other people. Daniel Goleman, in his book on emotional intelligence, talks about another research. And this time it was a research of 450 boys. And most of those boys were son of immigrants, very modest backgrounds. This research was done in a place called Somerville, which is near Massachusetts. You have all these MITs and Harvards of the world. They're all there, right? In fact, 1/3 of those 450 boys, approximately 95 boys, they had IQs less than 90. Obviously, IQ less than 90 is considered to be below average, right? And 2/3 of those guys had extremely good IQs, because those guys were from the same modest background, from the same area. The research from this, the findings from this research were extremely significant. When they finally analyzed the research through their success in life, very important factors came out. Because the guys who were able to handle frustrations better, the guys who were able to control emotions better, the guys who were able to get on well with other people, they were more successful. Now you have two kinds of researches. One was happening with graduates from the university, extremely educated, and this particular second research done on very modest, poor, slum kind of dwellers. Most of those children lived on doles given by the government, and there also the results were the same. So typically the result was that the boys who had good emotional stability, emotional brilliance, the guys who were very good at getting along with people, they were far more successful compared to the other group of people who did not have these emotional skills. So certain things we can infer from this. Academic education does not prepare one for such life skills, because life skills, they are the ones which will help you navigate the currents of life. Anybody's emotional aptitude is a meta ability. This can be learned, guys, but one has to put in lots and lots of conscious practice. That needs to be put in. That's important. So typically we are talking about people who are emotionally adept. So typically when we are talking about emotional attitude, we are talking about adeptness, people who knew and managed their feelings well, people who were able to deal with other people's feelings well, people who are able to pick up the unspoken rules. So these are the things that can bring success as far as life successes and progresses are concerned. And once again, we talked about interpersonal relationship. Of course, those are learned over a period of time, because these trainings prepare you for those life skills. But certain times what happened is, in a child development exercise, a research was also conducted with nursery preschool students, 3-4 years old. Daniel Goleman talks about this particular girl called as Judy, who is a 4-year-old girl. Typically, this girl is such that she will not plunge into the center of any game. She will be on the margins of any game. For example, when 2-3 girls are playing, she will not push herself into the game, but she will be on the margins. But she is a very keen observer. Normally in such schools, what happens is there is a game called as a classroom game. What they do is they create some kind of a doll kind of a figure, and on that figure they will paste the concerned girl's photograph. And in the room you will have 4 different corners. One will be an arts corner, blocks corner, sports corner, music corner, etc. Those corners will be there. And one girl will be given 15 or 20 dolls. Each one of those dolls will represent a particular girl from that class, maybe her own friends. But instead of that, the girl's photograph will be there on that doll. The job is to put that particular doll in a specific corner. For example, if some girl is good in music, she has to put that in the music corner. And then they test whether her judgment about that particular girl is correct or not. And in most of those exercises, it was Judy who used to get the topmost marks. Why was it because of? Because she was a very keen observer. This proves that she was a very good observer. And of course, there was another game, not just this game, another game that will test who is that particular girl in that particular class, which everyone wants to play with that girl. And even in that particular exercise, they found that this girl, Judy, was the one with whom most of the girls in the class wanted to play with, right? There were some surveys when the chits were open. Every single girl wants to play with Judy. Why? What was the reason? Though she was always on the margins of all the game, she never used to participate. She was not a very high IQ kid, but everyone wants to play with her because she was a very keen observer and she had excellent emotional skills. She used to be very polite. She used to be a go-getter. So these are some of the traits that this particular girl, Judy, had, as a result of which she was a much sought after girl in the class. So this means some of the social intelligence can be spotted too early in life, and typically that's what we are talking about. Now we are also going to talk about a very, very important aspect of a research by a professor called as Howard Gardner. This research is a very, very important research, guys. He was a professor in Howard School of Education and he created a test called as a project spectrum. In fact, the basic research of Gardner was he questioned the disproportionate focus given on IQ tests, your intelligent quotient test, measure of your academic intelligence. These IQ tests were developed during the First World War, during 1914. It was done by a professor called as Thurman, who was a professor in Stanford University. But maybe during that time, maybe we're talking about the First World War, 1914, you had 2 million students in US and you had to select a handful of people, the cream de la cream of the people. So probably at that point of time, they designed certain IQ tests, right? At that point of time. But Gardner, in his path-breaking research, it's also called as project spectrum, and he created a lot of instruments to assess different competencies in students and professionals, right? That was developed by Gardner himself. In fact, his path-breaking book, the name of the book was Frames of the Mind, which was written in the year 1983. In this particular book, he is not saying that IQ test should not be done, but what he proposes is it is not just one. You need to have string of other tests in order to determine the right talent. And those intelligence could be your academic intelligence, your verbal, mathematical, logical, spatial, etc., etc. That's what he pointed out. So he's made a complete instrument which is called as Gardner's Spectrum of Intelligence test. You can make a comparison, but when this comparison was made on an experimental basis, students were tested for IQ and the same students were tested for this particular instrument, which is Gardner's Spectrum of Intelligence tests. But there was no correlation because the guys who came out as best in the IQ test, when they were put through Gardner's Spectrum of Intelligence tests, out of the 8 or 10, some were good only in 2, some were good only in 3, which means they were lacking in the remaining skills. Gardner is not saying IQ should not be there, but what he tries to say is to be a well-rounded, all-rounded personality. People should possess all the skills because we are talking about success in life, guys. We are not talking about if you are going to be a college professor where only one skill is required. We are talking about corporate success. What skills are required in order to excel in your corporate life? So you need to have all-round skills, that is music, visual arts, social understanding. You need to be good at numbers. You need to be good at mechanics. One should be good at creativity. they have to take fast decisions. They should be risk takers, and so many such skills are required to become successful in your corporate, right? That's a game of corporate life. And that's what Gardner's research points out. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the last video, we talked a lot about what happens in our brain, the anatomy of the brain, etc. And in this, we have talked about nature of emotional intelligence. And in the subsequent videos, we will be building on this subject with proper examples just to have a proper understanding of the subject. Okay guys, I hope you like this video. This is Dr. Sadasivam signing off. Till we meet again. Bye bye. Jai Hind.